February 14th, 2026, 4:47 in the morning. 4 British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles crossed the Crimean coastline at 185 meters altitude, flying terrain-masked profiles toward the most heavily defended airbase in occupied Ukraine. Below them, the Black Sea Fleet Air Force headquarters in Sevastopol, rebuilt twice, protected by repositioned S-400 batteries, surrounded by decoy infrastructure. Russian commanders had spent months believing this facility was untouchable. They were wrong. 11 seconds. That's how long the impact sequence lasted. When it was over, Russia's Black Sea Fleet aviation coordination had gone completely dark. I'm your host at War Vector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What happened above Sevastopol in the early hours of February 14th wasn't just a missile strike. It was the payoff of 4 months of silent, invisible intelligence work, passive radar mapping, precision timing analysis, and a strike package built around a 40-second gap in Russian air defenses that most people would say didn't exist. Today, we're breaking down how Ukraine found that gap, how they exploited it, and why Russia's third attempt at making this facility impenetrable failed just as completely as the first two. Before this story ends, you'll understand exactly why 4 Storm Shadow missiles did what 2 prior strikes couldn't. You'll see the intelligence operation that made it possible, and you'll learn something about modern air defense systems that Russian commanders wish they'd understood before February 14th. This isn't just a strike story. It's a lesson in the distance between believing you're protected and actually being protected. Let's start with the target. The Black Sea Fleet Air Force headquarters sits on the southwestern edge of Sevastopol. In peacetime, it managed logistics and flight coordination for Russia's entire Crimea-based aviation arm. By late 2025, it had become something more important. After Ukrainian HIMARS strikes degraded Russian forward air bases in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia oblasts, the Sevastopol hub absorbed additional command functions. Strike packages targeting Ukrainian infrastructure were now routed through this facility. Su-24 Fencer aircraft operating from Crimea received mission parameters, weather windows, and munitions allocation data from servers housed in the headquarters building. 3 hardened shelters on the compound's eastern edge held aircraft in various states of mission readiness. The facility had become, in operational terms, the nervous system of Russian air operations across the southern front. Russia knew this made it a target. The response was layered. After a Ukrainian missile strike damaged the headquarters' outer administration wing in October 2025, Russian engineers undertook what they described internally as a comprehensive hardening program. The main command building received reinforced concrete overhead protection, rated for near-miss detonations. A new S-400 Triumph battery was positioned on the compound's northern perimeter, joining an existing battery already covering the western approach corridor. Electronic warfare systems were densified around the facility. And most critically, the radar coverage was reorganized into a layered arc designed to close the approach angles that previous Ukrainian strikes had used. Russian commanders received briefings through January 2026, indicating the facility was now effectively impenetrable to cruise missile attack. The approach corridors previously used by Ukrainian missiles, low-altitude terrain masking from the northeast, had been closed by the repositioned S-400. The western approach over Sevastopol Bay was covered by a second battery. The air defense picture, as presented to the Black Sea Fleet Command, showed complete spherical coverage with overlapping radar arcs extending 40 kilometers in every direction. Which weapon system do you think proved decisive in this strike? A. Storm shadow terrain masking. B. Decoy drone radar saturation. C. The ELINT gap analysis. Comment your answer. The data might surprise you. They were confident, dangerously so. What Russian commanders couldn't know without the specific intelligence Ukraine had spent 4 months collecting, was that their complete radar coverage had a flaw. Not a deliberate one. Not a design failure in the S-400 itself. A rotation gap created by the physical geometry of 2 radar emitters positioned without perfect coordination. The northern battery's search radar completed a full 360-degree sweep every 12 seconds. The eastern battery, repositioned after October's strike, ran on a slightly different rotation cycle, optimized for the northeastern threat axis. The timing mismatch between the two systems created a blind spot in the eastern coverage arc, a 40-second window, repeating 3 times per hour. In that window, an object approaching from specific coordinates at specific altitudes was invisible to both radar systems simultaneously. Ukraine's GUR, the Military Intelligence Directorate, had been hunting for exactly this kind of vulnerability. The intelligence collection operation began in October 2025, running parallel to the facility's hardening program. GUR assets in occupied Crimea, a combination of human intelligence sources and remotely operated passive ELINT collection systems, began cataloging radar emission signatures from the Sevastopol air defense network. Passive ELINT collection doesn't emit signals. It listens. It records the precise timing, frequency, and rotation characteristics of every radar system it can detect. Over 4 months of patient, meticulous collection, GUR analysts built a complete signature library of every radar emitter protecting the Black Sea Fleet air headquarters. The analysis took weeks. Analysts cross-referenced emission timing data against precise positioning information from satellite imagery. They modeled the radar coverage mathematically, building a 3-dimensional picture of exactly where the gaps were, when they appeared, and how long they lasted. 3 months in, with the Eastern S-400 still being calibrated following October's strike, the rotation gap appeared in the data. 40 seconds, 3 times per hour. A corridor that opened and closed like a door blinking in the dark. Stay with me, because what happens next dismantles the assumptions behind Russia's entire Crimea air defense architecture. Ukrainian strike planners faced a precise engineering problem. They had a 40-second window appearing within a repeating cycle. They needed missiles through that window, precisely timed. And they needed to ensure Russian radar operators didn't simply switch to manual tracking or backup modes when they detected incoming threats. The solution needed 2 things: precise timing and deliberate radar saturation. The decoy component came first. Ukrainian planners selected 2 modified reconnaissance drones for the saturation role. These weren't FPV drones. They were larger platforms capable of sustained flight, modified to carry electronic emissions packages, designed to push ES-400 radar systems into active tracking mode. Active tracking is computationally intensive. When a Triumph radar locks onto a target, it dedicates processing resources to that contact. Enough simultaneous contacts, and the system's ability to detect and hand off additional threats degrades. The 2 decoy drones would approach the compound from the southwest, directly into the western battery's coverage arc, approximately 4 minutes before the Storm Shadow package arrived. Their job was to trigger active tracking locks, pull radar operator attention toward the western sector, and create a moment of cognitive overload in the Russian Air Defense Control Center, just as the real weapons entered the eastern gap. The Storm Shadow package consisted of 4 missiles. The Storm Shadow, designated Scalp EG by France, Supplied to Ukraine under British and French programs that had expanded Ukrainian long-range strike capability through 2025, is a subsonic cruise missile with a range exceeding 550 kilometers. Its Broach warhead uses a two-stage penetrating design. A precursor charge blasts through hardened material, and a main charge detonates inside, maximizing damage to reinforced structures. It flies terrain-masked profiles using digital terrain elevation data to hug geographic features and minimize radar exposure. And it can be programmed with extremely precise impact coordinates and approach angles. Ukrainian planners programmed the 4 missiles with individualized approach profiles, all timed to arrive within the 40-second window simultaneously. They flew different azimuth approaches converging on the target from slightly different angles, making simultaneous interception geometrically difficult, even if a radar operator detected them. They entered the coastline at 4:47 in the morning, flying at 185 meters, terrain-masked through the eastern hillsides west of Balaklava. Here's what's most surprising about the technical execution. The 40-second window wasn't a fixed interval. The rotation gap drifted slightly each hour as the 2 radar systems' cycles gradually fell in and out of phase. GUR analysts had modeled this drift and calculated the exact second to within a 3-second margin, when the gap would be at maximum overlap on the night of February 14th. The Storm Shadow launch was timed backward from that moment, accounting for flight time from the launch point, coastline crossing position, and terrain-masked approach speed. The precision required wasn't just engineering. It was months of accumulated intelligence converted into a launch window measured in seconds. The decoy drones crossed into radar coverage at 4:43 in the morning. What analysts reviewing the sequence would later describe as a textbook saturation event unfolded over the next 3 minutes. The Western S-400 battery's radar acquired both contacts and shifted into active tracking mode. The radar operators in the facility's air defense control cell began working the Western contacts. Intercept calculations were initiated. The tracks were assessed as small, slow-moving aerial vehicles, not immediately categorized as the highest priority threat. This part seems counterintuitive until you understand Russian air defense training. S-400 crews follow a prioritization doctrine that weights faster, higher altitude threats above slow movers. The decoy drones, flying slow subsonic profiles, were assessed as lower priority contacts. The operators were tracking them, but hadn't committed intercept assets. They were waiting for the threat classification system to provide more data. 4 minutes and 4 seconds after the decoys entered coverage, at 4:47 and 12 seconds, the 4 Storm Shadows entered the eastern radar arc's rotation gap. And this is where the plan almost fell apart. One of the 2 decoy drones failed. At 4:46 and 53 seconds, 19 seconds before the Storm Shadow package entered the gap, a mechanical failure caused the second decoy to deviate from its programmed approach path. Its radar signature changed. The Russian Air Defense Control Cell's tracking system flagged the anomaly. An operator shifted attention to the eastern sector to investigate whether the signature change indicated additional aerial threats approaching from an unexpected vector. For 11 seconds, a Russian radar operator was looking east. The Storm Shadows entered the gap at 4:47 and 12 seconds. They would cross the 40-second window and reach the compound perimeter at 4:47 and 38 seconds, 26 seconds of exposure. The eastern battery's radar completed its sweep and returned to the eastern arc at 4:47 and 41 seconds, 3 seconds after the missiles had already passed the facility perimeter. 3 seconds. That operator who looked east saw nothing. The missiles were terrain-masked, flying below the radar horizon at 185 meters inside the gap. By the time the radar arc swept back and would theoretically have acquired them, they were already inside minimum engagement range. The S-400 battery never fired. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because this is what the textbooks don't teach. The impact sequence began at 4:47 and 49 seconds. The first storm shadow struck the headquarters building's eastern wing at 4:47 and 49 seconds. The broach warhead performed as designed. Precursor charge penetrating the reinforced overhead protection. Main charge detonating inside the command floor. Structural collapse began immediately across the wing's upper 2 stories. Communication systems, server infrastructure, and the Flight Coordination Center housed in that section were destroyed in the initial detonation. The overpressure wave from the interior detonation cracked the building's central support structure. 2 seconds later, the second missile struck the headquarters building's command suite, the section housing senior air operations officers' work areas, and the primary encrypted communications nodes connecting the facility to Moscow's air defense coordination network. The broach warhead penetrated the reinforced wall section on the building's north face before detonating. The first and second impacts, arriving 2 seconds apart, created sequential overpressure events that structural engineers analyzing satellite imagery would later assess as responsible for the collapse of 60% of the main building's above-ground structure. At 4:47 and 55 seconds, the third missile struck the runway control facility, a separate structure on the compound's southern edge housing the primary approach and departure control systems for the adjacent airfield. This building was less heavily reinforced than the main headquarters. The impact was direct, through the roof, and the structural collapse was near total. The runway control facility ceased to exist as a functioning structure within seconds. The fourth missile, arriving at 4:48 and 0 seconds exactly, struck the hardened aircraft shelter on the compound's eastern edge. This shelter housed 3 Su-24 Fencer aircraft, loaded with reconnaissance equipment for a planned morning mission over Ukrainian positions in Kherson Oblast. The broach warhead's precursor charge was built for exactly this kind of reinforced concrete structure. The precursor punched through the shelter's roof, and the main charge detonated inside. The 3 Su-24s were destroyed in the resulting fire and structural collapse. The morning reconnaissance mission they had been preparing for never flew, 11 seconds from first impact to last. The compound was burning. Here's what stands out about the operational outcome. Russia had rebuilt this facility twice and believed the third version was proof against anything Ukraine could deliver. But the hardening program addressed the wrong problem. They reinforced the buildings. They repositioned the radar systems. What they didn't do, couldn't easily do without a complete redesign of the radar positioning, was eliminate the timing gap created by placing 2 S-400 batteries with mismatched rotation cycles. The facility was harder. It wasn't smarter. Ukraine brought intelligence, not just missiles. What would you have done differently as the Russian air defense commander responsible for protecting this facility? The gap was findable. Was it avoidable? Satellite imagery captured at 10:52 in the morning on February 14th confirmed the scale of destruction. The main headquarters building showed structural collapse across approximately 60% of its above-ground footprint. The command wing was completely collapsed. The runway control facility was a debris field. The hardened aircraft shelter on the eastern edge showed catastrophic roof penetration and subsequent internal fire damage. 6 secondary fires were still burning 6 hours after the strike, fueled by jet fuel from the destroyed aircraft and equipment from the collapsed structures. Russian communications in the hours following the strike revealed the organizational impact with a clarity that battlefield imagery alone couldn't. Intercepted frequencies showed a command network in acute crisis. Units that normally received morning strike allocation data from the Sevastopol headquarters were receiving nothing. Russian aviation assets at Crimean air bases were standing down missions as coordination authority transferred, slowly, confusedly, to backup facilities that hadn't previously exercised command of Black Sea Fleet aviation operations at this scale. If you believe tactics win wars, and the evidence from February 14th suggests they absolutely do, type war vector in the comments. 3 senior air operations officers had been evacuated from the facility approximately 90 minutes before the strike, following what Russian sources described as a security protocol review. The timing of that evacuation would later generate significant analytical discussion. It happened too early and too specifically to be coincidental, but not early enough to prevent the destruction of the facility's infrastructure, systems, and aircraft. Whether the evacuation resulted from a security leak, a coincidental protocol review, or something more deliberate in the Russian command's risk calculus remains unclear. What's clear is that the officers left 90 minutes before 4:47 in the morning, and the facility was struck at 4:47 in the morning. The building they had been working in did not survive the next 90 seconds. Here's the question the evacuation raises, and it's one that should genuinely concern Russian defense planners. If personnel were evacuated in the 90 minutes before the strike, does that suggest Russia had warning? And if they had warning, why were the S-400 batteries not placed on full active alert? Why were the aircraft not dispersed? Why was the radar coverage not shifted to manual tracking mode, which would have closed the rotation gap? The building was still full of equipment. The aircraft were still in their shelter. If the officers knew something was coming, they appear to have believed the air defenses would stop it. They believed the radar coverage was complete. Going back through the technical intelligence assessments of this strike, one detail kept coming back. The 40-second gap Ukraine exploited wasn't the product of Russian negligence. It was the product of Russian confidence. 2 S-400 batteries, each individually excellent, positioned by commanders who trusted the system's theoretical coverage envelope without modeling how the 2 systems' rotation cycles interacted. The gap was real. It was mathematically predictable. Russia didn't find it because they weren't looking for it. They were checking approach corridors, not timing architecture. Ukraine found it because they were listening to the radars, not studying the maps. Here's a take that'll probably get some pushback. Russia's failure here wasn't primarily a failure of air defense technology. The S-400 is a genuinely capable system. The failure was a failure of intellectual humility, a command culture that briefed the facility as impenetrable and then stopped looking for vulnerabilities. The officers who received those briefings went into February 14th, believing the problem was solved. In modern warfare, believing a problem is solved is the problem. Ukraine has demonstrated this principle repeatedly, and Russia keeps relearning it at catastrophic cost. The operational impact extended well beyond the compound's physical destruction. 3 runways at the adjacent Belbek Air Base, the primary operating base for Black Sea Fleet aviation, and the facility the Sevastopol headquarters directly supported, went into what Russian sources described as coordinated operations suspension in the hours following the strike. This wasn't physical damage to the runways. It was the loss of the coordination infrastructure that supported runway operations. Flight schedules, approach control, maintenance coordination, mission allocation. All of it had run through systems now buried under reinforced concrete rubble. The runways were intact. The ability to use them in coordinated military aviation operations had collapsed along with the headquarters building. Ukrainian General Staff, reporting in the 48 hours following the strike, noted a measurable reduction in Russian air activity over southern Ukraine. Reconnaissance missions providing Russian artillery with targeting data for positions in Kherson Oblast stopped flying. Strike packages scheduled against Ukrainian infrastructure in Mykolaiv and Odessa oblasts were postponed. The degradation wasn't permanent. Russia began reconstituting coordination functions at backup facilities within 72 hours. But the operational window was real and was exploited. Ukrainian forces in the Kherson bridgehead used the 48-hour reduction in Russian aerial reconnaissance to conduct resupply operations that would otherwise have carried significant risk of observation and subsequent artillery targeting. Equipment and ammunition staged kilometers back from forward positions moved forward during the reconnaissance gap. Ukrainian commanders would later describe this as a direct operational benefit of the Sevastopol strike, not the primary objective, but a consequence that produced measurable frontline advantage. What would NATO have done differently with the same intelligence package? The passive ELINT collection methodology, the radar gap analysis, the decoy saturation component. This mirrors high-end Western military doctrine closely. Comment your analysis of whether a NATO planning cell would have used a different approach, or whether Ukraine independently developed the same solution. The financial accounting is significant, independent of the operational impact. 3 Su-24 Fencer aircraft, estimated replacement cost approximately $25 million each in current procurement prices, destroyed in the hardened shelter. The shelter itself, rated for near-miss protection, destroyed. Communications and server infrastructure in the headquarters building, conservatively estimated at $15 million in specialized military hardware. The runway control facility, total loss. The structural damage to the main headquarters building, including the engineering cost of a potential third rebuild, substantial. Ukrainian sources estimated the total material loss at approximately $120 to $140 million, not including the operational cost of the 72-hour aviation coordination disruption. Against this, the Ukrainian strike package, 4 Storm Shadow missiles, 2 decoy drones, and the intelligence collection infrastructure that enabled the targeting. The missiles represent the largest single-cost element. Storm Shadows run approximately £800,000 each in British procurement pricing. The total expenditure for the strike package, even accounting for months of intelligence collection, is a fraction of the material destroyed. This asymmetry, cheap intelligence, expensive weapons on the Ukrainian side, very expensive infrastructure destroyed on the Russian side, is the financial logic of Ukraine's long-range strike campaign. It doesn't require numerical parity. It requires precision. And precision, as February 14th demonstrated again, requires intelligence. There's a detail about this strike that stayed with me after reviewing the full sequence. The decoy drone that failed at 4:46 and 53 seconds, 19 seconds before the Storm Shadows entered the gap, wasn't part of the plan. The strike was designed with 2 functioning decoys pulling attention west. One failed. What saved the mission wasn't a backup system or a redundant plan. It was the fact that the remaining decoy, combined with 4 months of positioning a strike window that depended on exact timing, was enough. The plan was robust enough to absorb its own partial failure. That's not luck, that's engineering. Ukraine built a strike package that could take a hit and still succeed. Against a facility Russian commanders had declared impenetrable. Real tactics, real consequences, war vector. Now for the answer to the quiz from earlier. How many vehicles did Ukraine destroy in the strike? The correct answer is 0 vehicles in the traditional sense. This was a facility and aircraft strike. 3 Su-24 aircraft were destroyed in the hardened shelter. What the question was designed to highlight is the difference between how we typically think about Ukrainian strikes: armored columns, vehicle destruction, HIMARS hitting convoys, and what the Storm Shadow campaign actually targets: aircraft, headquarters, command nodes, coordination infrastructure. The weapons are different. The targets are different. The strategic impact is different. Destroying a T-72 degrades 1 vehicle. Destroying an aviation coordination headquarters degrades the operational effectiveness of an entire regional air force for 72 hours. That's the lesson Russia keeps having to relearn. Was Ukraine right to wait 4 months before striking, allowing Russia to partially reconstitute operations from the October 2025 damage? Should they have struck sooner, with less perfect intelligence, accepting lower probability of success? Could Russia have prevented this with different radar positioning geometry for the S-400 batteries? And why didn't their own technical teams identify the rotation gap before Ukraine exploited it? What would you have done as the Ukrainian strike planner given only 2 functional decoy drones instead of 4? Would you have proceeded or postponed? Will Russia make a 4th attempt to rebuild this facility, or has the cost-benefit calculation finally shifted against it? Comment yes or no, and we read every comment. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Sevastopol compound is quiet now. The wreckage of 3 Su-24 aircraft still lies in the collapsed shelter on the eastern edge of the compound, buried under the reinforced concrete roof that was supposed to protect them. The main headquarters building is rubble. The radar systems that were supposed to make the facility impenetrable are intact. They worked exactly as designed. The gap between working as designed and actually being impenetrable is where Ukraine operates. It's 40 seconds wide, and it appears 3 times every hour. Stay vigilant.